Welcome to The Debate. Our discussion today, centers on something absolutely fundamental to being human: finitude. We're diving into some source material that makes a pretty provocative claim that mortality isn't some kind of flaw or a bug, but it's actually the Mortality Operating System. Essential, it argues, for making life meaningful, even sacred. So this isn't just thinking about death, it's really a statement about where human value comes from.
Mm.
And the central question, the real heart of our debate today, is this. Is that hard deadline, death, is it the necessary condition that creates life's meaning, its urgency, its depth? Or can we, through human intentionality, through sheer presence, generate profound meaning no matter how much time we might theoretically have? I'll be arguing that yes, mortality is fundamental. It structures meaning.
And I'll be challenging that idea, arguing that meaning comes more from our choices, our volition, rather than being strictly dependent on that ultimate time limit. It sets the stage well, I think, this tension between the necessity of an end and the power of our will. That's exactly where the source material pushes us to look.
Right, so my core thesis, and it really echoes the definitive stance in the text, is that mortality is the operating system. It's not optional. If you take away that hard constraint, that ending, well, the whole logic of urgency just collapses. Meaning starts to unravel. The text is quite clear. It argues mortality functions as a creative constraint, a boundary that's actually indispensable. Think of it maybe like a piece of music. The pauses, the rests, the final note. That's what gives the note's definition, emotional weight. Without the edges of the canvas, the painting just becomes this endless, undefined sprawl. Because life ends, every single decision, every focused moment, whether it's, say, committing to a difficult project or just being fully present with someone you care about, it becomes, as the text puts it, sacred. This looming necessity, it drives what the text calls radical, urgent, intentional living.
Sacred currency. If you genuinely believe that currency was infinite, well, you'd stop spending it carefully, wouldn't you? You'd just perpetually put off the hard, meaningful stuff.
Okay, I see the logic there, and I absolutely agree that the psychological pull towards deferral, given infinite time, would be immense. But I have to challenge the idea that mortality is the sole necessary condition for meaning. I mean, yes, awareness of death, undeniably powerful. It accelerates things, amplifies intensity, brings clarity. But I think the fundamental worth of life comes from the living itself, from our intentional choices, not purely from the countdown clock. So my core thesis really centers on this idea of volitional meaning, meaning that springs from deliberate acts. Creation, love, presence, courage, acts the material itself calls a rebellion against the void. These are chosen acts. And I think actually the source material itself offers pretty strong evidence against finitude being strictly necessary. It critiques chasing immortality, right? Calls it a prison disguised as a prize, leading to detachment, deferral, and numbness. Now that numbness, for me, that's not proof that meaning is impossible with infinite time. It's proof that the individual chose stagnation, intellectual and emotional laziness, if you will. If an infinite life leads to indifference, the fault lies in the failure of will, the failure of intention to stay engaged, not in the timeline itself. So the answer is intentional living, no matter the clock.
That's an interesting framing, but I think we need to be careful about drifting into an idealized philosophical space versus, well, psychological reality. We're talking about fundamental human tendencies here. The source material is pretty direct. If time is infinite, urgency disappears, and without limits, nothing matters. I don't think this is just some theoretical temptation an immortal could simply choose to overcome easily. It feels like a deeper, almost inevitable psychological corrosion of motivation. Let's zero in on that deferral trap you mentioned. If an immortal, as you suggest, decides to set their own deadline, okay, I'll write my masterpiece in the next 10 years. What actually stops them from just hitting snooze on that internal alarm the second the writing gets truly hard? When the frustration hits, or the doubt, or just plain boredom, the lack of an ultimate, unmovable boundary makes that arbitrary deadline infinitely renegotiable, doesn't it? The fundamental truth of scarcity just isn't there. And that renders all those self-imposed limits, well, a bit flimsy in the long run. The promise of tomorrow, stretching out forever, lets us always pick the path of least resistance. And that robs us of the very motivation needed for the deep, difficult, and therefore meaningful work.
I absolutely concede the temptation to delay hard things is huge, even for us mortals. But the source material also hands us the antidote, doesn't it? It gives us that practical wisdom demanding we stop waiting and stop saying someday. The power of that wisdom, I'd argue, can transcend the timeline. So, to your point directly, what stops the immortal from pushing back their 10-year project? Well, it's their commitment to the project's intrinsic worth. If that individual has really cultivated the fire over fear mindset the source material champions, then they're driven by the value of creation itself, of contribution, not primarily by the fear of running out of time. If meaning is rooted, as the text also suggests, in connection, in creation, then the drive is internal. It's about the quality of their own consciousness, their relationships. So the loss of motivation you describe, I think it stems from letting that internal commitment to urgency wither, not from the lack of an external wall. If an immortal can genuinely maintain presence day after day, they can sustain meaning.
Okay, let's shift slightly from the practical deadlines to the maybe deeper philosophical bedrock here, the idea that finitude is necessary for authenticity and depth. The material explicitly draws on existential thought. You see echoes of Heidegger, for instance. It stresses that only by facing death, by engaging in what Heidegger called sein som Tode, or being toward death, only then can we live truly authentically.
Right, the Heidegger connection is clear.
For Heidegger, authentic existence means recognizing your possibilities are shaped, limited by your ultimate end. That constant background awareness forces you out of the sort of unthinking crowd mentality, the they, das man, and into genuine engagement with your life. Right now, it makes you take ownership. And then there's Rilke, who's invoked to show how impermanence gives depth to experience, making love an active courage in the face of time. The whole image used in the text, the mortal flame, it burns bright because it knows it won't last. If you take away that possibility of extinction, don't you fundamentally diminish the tension that creates that courageous, authentic depth?
I have to push back on that interpretation because it feels like it assumes depth and authenticity only come from scarcity. I absolutely agree on the power of that existential wake-up call. But let's look closer at the mechanism. We both agree. People who've had close brushes with death often live with incredible intensity afterwards. That proves the awareness of high stakes is a potent catalyst, yes? But why must that intensity automatically vanish if the awareness remains, but the time horizon stretches? I think we sometimes confuse the intense emotion of an ending, that idea that we cry because life ends, but more importantly, because it's worth ending. We confuse that feeling with the source of the worth itself. The worth surely is established in the living part, the loving, the creating, the choosing presence over numbness. And Rilke, yes, he talks about impermanence, but often in terms of transformation, the beauty of things passing into us, allowing us to carry their essence forward. If an immortal actively embraces transformation, keeps making those acts of courage, choosing emotional risk, even without the clock ticking down, why wouldn't the meaning remain just as whole? The ending might confirm the investment was valuable. I'm not convinced it creates the value itself.
But how do we guarantee that ongoing commitment to transformation without that ultimate anchor? Which brings us, I think, to the third core function the material gives, finitude. It explicitly states death is the compass that points us back to what matters most. It's presented as the mechanism that forces us into that deep, necessary self-reflection. When we're really confronted with our limits of finite future, we're compelled to ask those big questions. What do I truly want? Who do I want to become? What am I leaving behind? This forced confrontation with limits and legacy, it feels like the passive yet incredibly powerful engine generating meaning. Immortality, on the other hand, seems to allow one to just perpetually put off those critical questions. There's always time for self-improvement later. The kind of intentional, self-reflective life you're describing, I suspect it's only consistently, rigorously pursued when the stakes feel truly existential. Mortality keeps those stakes high, ensuring that compass needle keeps pointing towards authenticity.
Is that it seems to paint humans as fundamentally reactive creatures, always needing an external threat to maintain internal wisdom. The source material itself tells us to answer those fundamental questions: what we want, who we want to be today, now, regardless of when death might actually arrive. It demands we become proactive agents of our own meaning. So if an individual, maybe after some initial existential shock, which, by the way, could happen today even for a hypothetical immortal, if they truly integrate that profound understanding of purpose, why must the meaning automatically decay over time? Meaning is sustained through action. If an immortal commits day in and day out to a life defined by maximizing presence, truth, creation, the quality of their life, that feeling of aliveness the text talks about, well, theoretically, it should persist. Think about that final reflection in the text. You don't really want immortality. You want a life that feels alive. That feels like the absolute key distinction to me. The goal isn't endless time. It's the feeling of aliveness. And that's achieved, according to the text, by choosing truth over safety and fire over fear. If an immortal maintains that choice, rigorously, intentionally, then they've met the condition for meaning. The time limit might be a fantastic catalyst, a great spark to get things going, sure, but it's the internal volitional choice that keeps the fire burning.
Well, our discussion, I think, keeps circling back to and reinforcing that core assertion. Mortality is the engine of meaning precisely because it's the ultimate source of scarcity. It creates those finite boundaries, the edges that lend weight, gravity, a kind of sacredness to every choice we make. Without that edge of the canvas, the urgency just evaporates. And that leads straight to the detachment and numbness the source material explicitly warns against. Life's stakes are highest, and therefore its authenticity is maximized, exactly because the time we have is this diminishing sacred currency. The end isn't a bug, it's the necessary structure that guarantees value.
And while I absolutely acknowledge the profound, undeniable power of mortality as a motivator, as an external constraint, maybe even a compass, our debate, I hope, highlights that meaning is ultimately rooted much deeper in internal intention, in courage, in action. That focus throughout the material on radical, urgent, intentional living, it suggests that the choice to live fully, that's the real superpower here. And that's a choice that could, at least theoretically, be sustained even if the ultimate physical deadline were somehow removed. We should fear living a life that lacks depth, lacks truth, perhaps more than we fear the timeline itself being extended. The architecture of meaning, I'd argue, is ultimately internal, even if the initial blueprints are often drawn up in response to external realities.
Ultimately, if the source material really pushes us hard to confront not just the fact of our ending, but the quality of the life we're building right now, today, within whatever limits we're given.
Exactly. And our disagreement really hinges on whether that external constraint of time is absolutely necessary to keep maintaining that quality indefinitely, or if it's perhaps more of a powerful initial spark, igniting the intentional, volitional life that hopefully follows. We hope this exchange has maybe deepened the understanding of that rich tension between permanence and presence, which is captured so compellingly in the source material.